Alright, so today's just going to be a real quick, fun, short video where I take you behind the scenes of the podcast. I think for those of you who watch or listen every single week, you might find this interesting. It's not something I talk about very much in terms of how I actually take a podcast from step 0 to step 40, however many steps it is. So we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to quickly run through the equipment that I use, and we're actually going to run through step by step of the podcast I'm about to record. So the next podcast I'm recording is with Dr. Chris Jenkins. By the time you're seeing this video, it will already be out. Dr. Jenkins is the founder of the Orianne Society and also the host of the Snake Talk podcast. Very much looking forward to talking with him. So I'm going to take you through how I go through setting up the interview with him, going through the research, editing, recording the show, obviously, and getting it published to podcast and YouTube as well. So first off, let's take a look at the equipment. So here's my desk and my computer. This is where all the recording happens. Of course, you guys are used to seeing this side, the animal side. This is the side that I spend most of the day staring at. So this is my favorite piece of equipment. This is the Zoom H6, and this is what I run my audio through, my microphone through. This actually plugs directly into my computer, but it can also record audio. It runs on batteries, and I can record audio right to an SD card and record portably. That's what I did when I met Mike Tatula in that hotel randomly in October. I just took this to him. I brought 2 microphones, and we were able to simply record with very little equipment involved. So I love this piece of equipment. Makes my life very, very easy. And that is plugged into my Shure SM58, which is actually a relatively cheap microphone. This is the microphone that you'll see basically at any concert. It's a classic musician microphone. Really, really durable. That's why I have a few of them. These are easy to transport if I'm doing portable shows and whatnot. And this mic works very well, and it's sitting on top of a blue microphone arm. And then I just have classic Audio-Technica podcasting headphones. All right, so as I said, my computer is set up like this. It's kind of hard to see here. I have an Audacity program running while I record. This is strictly for, I know it's kind of hard to see, that is strictly for backup. That's recording my guest's audio as a backup. I have Adobe Audition, which is recording my audio. We use Zoom down here. That's where the video comes in, and that's how and that also records both video and audio for myself and my guests. And then I have my notes sitting on my keyboard, which is out of the camera shot. This is my notes from the podcast I recorded with Eric Burke. And then right there is my tripod. That's where my phone sits to record my video of the podcast from this angle here. So I think a question that many people have is, how do I choose my guests for the podcast? And really there's a multitude of different ways that happens. Sometimes you guys, the listeners, will recommend people for me. Sometimes it's just me cruising through Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, and I'll find people who I think are up to some interesting things. Or sometimes the people themselves will actually reach out and say, hey, this is the work that I'm up to, and I'd love to come on the podcast and talk about it. So those are sort of the 3 avenues that I find guests. Now for today, Dr. Chris Jenkins is the host of the Snake Talk podcast. Like I said, I discovered Snake Talk when someone shared it on Facebook. I think one of my friends had shared it, and I started listening to it, and I really love it. It really focuses on conservation. They do some wildlife trafficking and importing and conversations about that, and I really want to talk to him about how that intersects with the hobby. So that's where my interest came, and I recommend going and check out the podcast if you haven't. Dr. Chris Jenkins doesn't know who I am, or at least I don't think he knows who I am, so I'm going to have to reach out to him first and see if we can get him to come on the show. I really hope he is interested in having that conversation. Most people are, so we're going to send him a message on Instagram and see if we can catch his attention and see if we can set something up. Okay, so now that the date has been booked, really the next step is just doing research for the episode. So I'm going to spend some time on the Orianne Society's website. I'll go to Dr. Chris Jenkins' Instagram and kind of flip through there, and I'll probably listen to a couple episodes of the podcast. I haven't listened to them all, and that'll just get my brain working and figuring out the idea or the direction that I'd like the episode to head. So first off is me taking notes, and then I'll set up an email and send it to Dr. Jenkins so he can have an understanding of what the podcast is going to entail. So first, we do the research. Okay, so my rough note-taking for this podcast is pretty much complete. I have it here. You will not be able to read that because pretty much only I can read my writing, but I have it all laid out. I'll probably spend the next few days as well listening to a couple episodes of the Snake Talk podcast just to see if I can generate a few more ideas. But as far as the podcast itself goes, I really want to discuss with Dr. Jenkins about snake conservation, and he kind of alludes to this in the podcast. There's sort of a disdain towards snakes in the general public, which definitely poses a much greater challenge when it comes to conservation. protection. They are not a cute, fuzzy animal that everybody's just wanting to protect. Many people are very afraid of snakes and are just happy to see them dead. So that adds an additional layer to conservation. So I want to talk to him about that. I want to talk to him about rewilding, because I know they've done that with the eastern indigo snakes, and so that's a really fascinating discussion. And also I want to discuss with him what his thoughts of the captive pet trade are. Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it somewhere in between? So I'm sure he'll have a great answer for all that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we're pretty much ready. Now, before I actually record the podcast, I will record this sort of chicken scratch notes into something a little more easier for me to follow. This is the episode I did with Eric Burke from Morelia Python Radio. I have a sheet like this, and I usually make that the day of or the day before the podcast, just so everything is straight in my mind. We're still sitting about a week before the podcast, so I normally save that till then. But before we record the podcast, the next step, or the last step before actually hitting the red record button, is letting Dr. Chris Jenkins know what the podcast is about. So I'm going to send him an email and I'll kind of show you the template I send, and then we'll record. So by the way, before we actually do the email template, I'll show you all the notes I've collected over time. So these are all the podcast notes that I've taken over the 2.5 years of recording the podcast. There's papers in here that I've read prior to doing the episodes. Most of it is just the handwritten notes like I was just showing you guys. And yeah, I really am never going to throw this out. I really like looking back onto it. And you can look all the way back to the very first episode of the Animals at Home podcast. It's actually not the first, it's the third episode, but it's the first episode I did with a guest, and that was with TC Houston of Reptile Mountain. And wow, my printing was really nice back then. And this is it. I remember being incredibly nervous and panicking over this. I have a little checklist to make sure I did everything. I actually still write this checklist on every podcast note that I do, because I just like routine. And yeah, so this is the original. I'm actually surprised at how few talking points I gave myself, but the episode went really well, and this was the beginning of it all, and we're going to have TC back on the podcast very soon in the future to revisit. So I can never throw this out. It's so awesome. All right, it is time to record the episode. We're about 10 minutes away before our Zoom chat is going to start. Just going to check the microphone levels. Everything looks good. Everything's set up. I'm going to get you guys set up on the tripod. You can see we're all good to go. I'll put you guys on the tripod, and let's record the episode.
Dylan.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
That is great. So, Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure chatting with you. So thank you for joining me.
It was great being here. Thank you.
All right, we did it. That is the end. That was great. Thank you so much for doing that. I really, and like I said, I'll just keep in touch with you when we post this.
Sounds good. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, that is the end of that episode. We just wrapped up. Really enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Jenkins. We covered everything I wanted to discuss, and it was just fascinating. So I hope you go check out his podcast as well as the episode that we did together. And now, the fun part, editing. So as far as editing goes, it is pretty straightforward, but it is very time-consuming. The first thing I do is equalize and compress my audio, and that makes it go from sounding like this to sounding like this. Obviously, this sounds much better. I really do like that SM58 microphone that I showed you at the beginning, but it really sounds so much better once it's gone through an equalization, a compression, or else it sounds a little bit dampened. So anyway, I do that to my microphone, and then I do that to the guest's audio as well. It doesn't help a ton on the guest's audio because I am dealing with the Zoom audio file, which is a quite compressed audio file to begin with. And then I go through the very tedious part, which is removing the Zoom video that I have. Remember, when I'm on Zoom, I'm using my webcam from my laptop, which is a very low quality video, and I replace that with the iPhone video that I'm filming that I set you guys up on the tripod at the beginning. So I have to go back through and cut out all the webcam footage and replace it with my iPhone footage. It's easier said than done. It does take a lot of time, and if you do watch the podcast on YouTube, you'll see once in a while I do make a mistake and I leave the webcam footage in there for a quick flash of a second, so you may notice that. So if you ever have noticed a little low quality clip show up in the podcast from time to time, that is why. Now, this podcast was a little bit easier to edit than normal because Chris turned his webcam off once we started officially recording, just to keep the internet connection clean because he was out at the cabin. So that means I can simply delete the entire Zoom video file completely and just use the iPhone footage and then use the picture that Chris sent me as a still image and just place that whenever he is talking. Okay, so now that the episode is completely edited, the last thing I need to do is record the intro and the outro. I always do that afterwards. And honestly, this is one of the most tedious parts of the entire process for me because I mess it up over and over and over again. It always takes me a long time to do it, but it must get done. So let's get to it. Welcome to episode number 83 of the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin. Thank you very much for joining me today. We really covered a lot of ground in this episode. Starting with how Chris got into reptiles in the first place, and we really covered a lot of ground in this episode, starting from how Chris got into reptiles, how he discovered he wanted to pursue a career in wildlife conservation and wildlife biology. All right, that is the end of that episode. Thank you, guys. Okay, that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening. I will catch you guys next week. All right, so the intro and outro are complete. Now I just have to go back through the file and edit out all the mistakes that I made and clean it up, and then I'll post it at the beginning and at the end of the episode, and then we can export the episode and the editing is basically done. Then we move on to show notes and uploading and the thumbnail and whatnot, but that's for later. Let's finish this now. So just adding the intro here as well as some background music as I open up the show, and I also add those sound bite clips at the beginning. I usually add 2 or 3 sort of like cliffhanger type clips at the beginning. You guys will have to let me know if you like that I do that. I used to not do that, and I started doing that a few episodes ago. Let me know if you like getting a little sample of the episode before we actually get into it, or would you rather me just hit play on the episode after I run through the intro? Okay, so now that the episode has been exported, I'm just going to quickly blast through the remaining steps. I quickly build a thumbnail in Canva. Then I move on to uploading the video file to YouTube and the MP3 file to Libsyn. Libsyn is my podcast host, and once it's uploaded there, they take care of making sure it ends up in iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and all the other podcasting apps. Then I build out the show notes page over at animalsathomenetwork.com. Then I take that information and paste it into the description on YouTube as well as the show notes on Libsyn. And finally, I make sure there's an episode tile under the Animals at Home podcast header. This links to the show notes as well as an online player to allow you to play the podcast right off the show notes page, and also links to iTunes, Spotify, and any other podcasting app. So at this point, the podcast has been scheduled on YouTube as well as Libsyn, and now the next step for me is posting it on the Patreon page so the patrons can have early access to the episode. And the final step of this process happens Sunday at 9 a.m. when the episode officially goes live. Once the episode is live, I share an Instagram story, an Instagram post, and usually a couple of Facebook posts. And then I try to keep up with the YouTube comments throughout the day as best as I can. Here's one quick little secret. If you follow the podcast on any podcasting app, such as Apple or Spotify, the episodes are typically available 1 or 2 hours before that 9 a.m. Central Time. I always want to make sure that it's out on the podcasting apps before I hit publish on YouTube. Okay, so that is the entire behind the scenes look at producing the podcast, and that takes us to about Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon after I finish, answering some of the YouTube comments. And Monday morning, we restart it all again to start editing the episode for the following week. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about how I produce the podcast or any questions that are related to this topic, definitely drop them in the comments below. I hope you go check out the podcast if you haven't already. As you can see, it is quite a lot of work to put this thing together, but I do enjoy it. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as the podcast on your favorite podcasting app so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you do want to join us on Patreon, head to patreon.com/animalsathome. There you'll have early access to the episodes as well as a few other bonus perks. I will catch you guys in the next episode.